Welcome to episode 4 of the IT training series. This is, again, the preparation for the actual training that will begin on July 3rd. Today in our session, we're going to talk about how to use the Cybex book to ensure that your training is successful. Welcome back. And today we're going to talk about how to use the Cybex book to accomplish your goal of becoming certified in whichever one of these certifications you want to do, but in particular, IT Fundamentals Plus. So this book is laid out in a particular way that will ensure success for you. This is going to be a two-part session. First of all, we're going to talk about the book, and then we're going to talk about some supplemental pieces that are available to you that's called interactive online learning. And so today, as we dive into the book, let's take a look at what this offers. So the book contains a number of aids for you in learning that I will supplement with the video audio sessions that we're going to do here. First of all, obviously the book contains chapters that that show you the content of the course. And I definitely recommend that you read those from beginning to end as a high level. But of course, not everything are things that you need to learn, and not everything are those items that you need to absolutely understand in order to become certified. So within each of the chapters, there are sub-functions that you need to look at. So first of all, the content of the course is designed in chapter format. So there's multiple chapters in here, and each chapter has a different subject. So we'll have a chapter on motherboards, for example, or the hardware that's associated with that. And that's chapter 1. And eventually we'll get down to some of the security chapters. Within that, then you're going to have sections there that talk about exercises. They will allow you to expand on the reading, the learning that you have there. And there's a section called objectives. Now, the objectives section is the one that I want you to pay a little bit of attention to. And if you were to have your book in front of you, and for example, you would turn to the header for the page for the first chapter here, okay? Chapter 1, core hardware components. What you're looking at are these objectives right here that are actually on the first page of the chapter, as well as on the back of the page of the chapter. So these are a good way to go through here. And here's how I want you to learn that. So what I'd like you to do is say, okay, first of all, we have input here. So what I want you to do is I want you to read that in advance. There's input and processing and output and storage. There's storage units and bit and byte and KB, MB, GB, TB, PB, and all those kinds of things that are here. So there's two ways I want you to look at this piece here. First of all, I want you to kind of, if you can, take a little photocopy or a snapshot of this and keep it off to the side of the book as you're doing your training. So as you're going through the chapter, you can actually take notes next to these, because these are important exam objectives right here. You need to know what input is, and you need to know what processing is. So when you understand what these things are, that is a huge piece in taking the exam, because you'll understand the language that is being used throughout the book and throughout the testing. So for example, how many of you know what MB would stand for? Well, that's megabyte. Do you actually understand what megabyte means, as far as whether it's a thousand kilobits or whatnot? So a gigabit, for example, a GB. I think most of us understand what gigabit is, because we live in a gigabit world, right? We have gigabit internet service, we have gigabit thumb drives, and so on and so forth. But gigabit's basically 1,000 megabytes. And so these are different sizes, or a terabyte, or a petabyte, a PB, a petabyte, for example. So these are things that what you'll need to do is have this off to the side and actually take notes on it. What is a KB? What does it mean? Kilobyte. So I would write out kilobyte beside that, and then I would define what that means as far as a numerical value. So like, for example, a gigabyte here is basically 1,000 megabytes. So I would write gigabyte 1,000 MB as a note off to the side. That's how I would use this piece here, because this is going to be the key for your learning, if you will. Once you understand and know all these things, then the content of the course will just be layers on top of the formation or the foundational piece of the cake, so to speak. So you're going to look at these as your objectives. You're going to want to go through that. So I've identified that there's exercises in here, but there's also objectives that are identified and notes. Okay, so let's take a look at the notes first. So this right here it actually identifies, it's a note. And in this particular one, it says throughout this section, I will specifically talk about PC desktop and laptop hardware. Many of the principles here apply to smaller devices such as tablets and smartphones as well. So what they're doing is they're expanding on that. Even though I'm talking about a desktop or a laptop, when we're talking about a motherboard, for example, that also applies to your mobile device, your tablet or your phone. They have motherboards in them as well. So it's just a little note for you to take there. I will tell you the notes are not something that I would take notes on. I would just make a mental note of it, because the note piece is probably not going to be on your exam. It's the objectives. So here we are going back to this, the objectives that will be on your exam. All right. So another thing that's very important in these books is they'll give you photographs, or what they call figures here. Okay. So this is a photograph of a motherboard. And one of the things I've done in my testing before, or my practicing before, is I'll take a photocopy of this or a screenshot of this, and I'll actually take a pen and I'll draw, okay, that's the CPU, or those are sockets. That's for memory, whatever it is. I'm kind of reading it upside down. That's potentially an RJ45 connection, and so on and so forth. I'll identify what those are on my, you could probably identify them right here on your book as well, just so as you glance back through it when you're prepping for the study, you can quickly see what's going on there. So they're going to be photos that are a part of that. There's also going to be tables in here, like this one right here, that define the motherboard form factors. And so as we go through here, I'll try and highlight for you what is important for your study and what is not important for your study on those kinds of things. Continuing on through the book, we can see there's more pictures, but we come to this scenario, this item here called real world scenario. And what this does is this takes your book learning and addresses it with a practical knowledge as well. So really the real world scenarios are a lot of what I'm trying to do to help you through this book process. Is these podcasts, if you will, are going to apply that real world knowledge, a real world scenario to your knowledge. So moving on through this, you're going to see, again, a lot more pictures. Really a heavy focus on zooming in on that larger picture of the motherboard, for example. We're going to zoom in, and it's going to talk, here we have one that talks about a processor, or the BIOS chips that are on the motherboard. And I'm sorry, but that camera is not working well right now. But that's figure 1.12 in your book, if you wanted to follow along, or if you're following along from an audio perspective. Figure 1.12 on page 18 is what I'm referencing here, that's identifying a BIOS chip on the motherboard. So let me go back real quick again. If I showed you figure 1.1 on page 5, which was an overhead view of an entire motherboard. Well, as you move through this book, there are zoom ins, if you will, of that photo. So figure 1.12 and figure 1.9 and 10 and 11 are all zoom ins of that motherboard that show you exactly what each of those components are and how they are applied. So anyway, this book is going to go through that. It's going to show you those photos, show you the scenarios. And then once you get towards the end of the chapters, so again, if you go to page 26, there's a section here called exercise. And so this is exercise 1.1. And what it does is it walks you through a practical effort in Windows 10, open the calculator application, and so on and so forth. So there's ways for you to learn through those exercises. And then there's an exercise 1.2, and so on and so forth. Then as you're moving through this first chapter of this book, there's actually, let's see, there's 4 exercises there so far. So I got the exercise 1.4. And of course, the 1 is just denoting that it's chapter 1, and the 4 or the 2 or the 3 are just denoting that it is exercise number 4 or whatnot. So then we get down to a section on page 56 that is called Exam Essentials. And this is identifying for you exactly what is going to be expected of you on the exam. These are things you absolutely need to make sure that you know. For example, exam essentials. It says that you must illustrate the basics of computing and processing. All right, great. What does that mean? It says at a fundamental level, most users want computers to do 4 things. Take input. Now, if you go back to our initial objectives on page 1 of chapter 1, the very first word in there was input. Next thing it says is provide processing on the input, produce output. Output was one of those things that was on the objectives, and provide long-term storage. And guess what? Storage was another thing that was on there. So the exam essentials are giving you an overview of the things that you need to look at. So if you tie the exam essentials to the objectives that are at the very beginning of the chapter, and you make sure you focus on what those objectives are, you're going to be able to pass this exam quite well. Now, at the back of every single chapter are what they call review questions, or they are test questions. Now, these are not the exact questions that you'll see on the examination. However, they are like those questions, and these are just designed to kind of give you an idea, a feel, if you will, of what these questions are about. So, for example, let's take review question number 1. Which components of your computer store data? It says choose 3. There are 5 options here, so a couple of them are not gonna work. All right, so option is A, RAM, random access memory; B, SSD, which is a solid state drive; C, PCI, which is in the security world, stands for payment card industry, but in this particular world, and this is one of the things you have to watch out for when you really get to know computers, this is where a card slot would go into for an expansion card, like a video card. Then there's a D, a PSU, and E, a BD-ROM, which is a Blu-ray type of drive, and a ROM is like a hard drive, like a CD type of scenario. So we need to choose 3 of those. So I'm going to choose E, which is BD-ROM. I'm going to choose B, which is SSD, and A is RAM, because all of those are components on your computer that somehow store data. Now, so that's the way that you would go through these questions. Now, if you want to know if you're right, you swing back to Appendix B at the very back of the book, which is some 500 pages away, and you look up in Appendix B, you look up the chapter, and it's right there. Number 1, A, B, and E. RAM is memory, which is a temporary data storage area. SSD is a type of hard drive, and BD-ROM are disks that store data as well. PCI is the expansion slot, and PSU is a power supply unit. So it not only gives you the answer, but it also gives you an explanation of why you're right or why you're wrong. So what I do with these review questions, and usually there's either 10 or 20 review questions. In this particular case, there are 20. I will go through and either I will take a little yellow sticky, like this, or a separate piece of paper, and I will mark 1 through 20, and then I will write down my answers, A, B, E, and then, or if it's just a single answer, A, and so on and so forth. And then I will go back to the back of the book and verify that my knowledge is correct. So speaking of which, the back of the book. So that's the review questions are the back of the chapter. Let's talk about the back of the book real quick. So the back of the book, which will be the last thing we speak of, has an Appendix A and Appendix B. All right. Appendix A are the answers to the written labs. So remember a minute ago, we were talking about the labs. It's item 1.1 or exercise 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, so on and so forth. Those are the answers to the labs in Appendix A, and the Appendix B are the answers to the review questions or the potential test questions. All right, so that gives you a little bit of an overview of how to go through this book, how we're going to go through the book. Now, when I do my podcast, I am not going to read each of the sections of these chapters. What I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize a portion of the chapter, and I'm going to highlight pieces of it that are absolutely important for you to understand, tying them back to the objectives, and then also giving you some real world scenario, real world example type of functions. All right. Now, again, as I've told you before, the only way this is going to work is if you communicate with me. So my initial teaching, if you will, is going to be based, just like I said, I'm going to give you information that I believe is important. But what I want to do is I want to hear back from you as to what you're struggling with and where you're having challenges with, because each week and each day although they may progress through a chapter and progress through pages, we can go backwards and readdress things that are challenges. So you can email me at mhoupt@commonsensesecurity.net, or if you have a more friendly relationship with me, you're more than welcome to ping me on Facebook, or if you work with me in the office, you can ping me on Slack or whatever other tool you can to come up and just provide these questions that you have, and I'll be happy to address them broadly for everyone. But predominantly what we'll do is we'll go through each chapter, probably take a 2-week span to go through each chapter to make sure all the information is active and in the forefront of your mind. Make sure the objectives are met, and then we'll go and work through those. So again, the books, the chapter itself, all the content in there, I expect it would be best for you to read that. Pay very close attention to the objectives that are at the front, or what they call the objectives that are at the very front of every chapter. Personally, like I said, I take a photocopy of them and I put them at the side of me while I read through the chapter. Pay attention to the exercises, and definitely do the review questions at the back and check your answers to see where you're at. Out of 20 questions, you should be scoring about a 90% before you move on to the next chapter on those review questions. And I don't mean 90% as in you're memorizing them. I mean 90% on the first or second run. So don't even take the review questions until you believe you're at that level, until you have a grasp of what's going on in that chapter. Otherwise, you might get a little bit farther behind. But hopefully that helps you understand how we're going to go through this. It prepares you for it, and then we're going to go through each of those. All right, you have a wonderful day, and I'm going to come back in a couple of days with part 2 of this on how to use the interactive online learning function and what benefits that will have for you. Have a wonderful day.